In this video, I want to share with you a tip when working with rusty nuts and rusty bolts on an old car. If you follow this procedure, you can save yourself a lot of grief, because if you break a stud or you break a bolt, it just becomes a big headache. So the very first thing you have to do is clean the area around the bolt and the nut to make sure you get rid of any flaky rust. This was the real bad one right here. So I like to soak these up with a rust penetrant, preferably overnight if possible. Now, I put some stuff on this about 6 hours ago. These are my two rust penetrants of choice. Number one is Croil oil, and number two is a PB Blaster. You should be able to find one or the other of these in your local hardware or auto parts stores. So I've let this soak, and just before I attack it, I'm going to spray it again and wet it down. I'm going to spray this one over here. And then this is really important, that if the head of the nut or the head of the bolt has been rusty, you want to get a 6-point socket. Don't use a 12-point socket. If you round the nut or the head of the bolt off, then you have another problem you have to deal with. So use a 6-point socket. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to work it loose. I'm going to try to snap it loose. Now, I'm using a long ratchet handle here I customized, but you don't want to use this much torque. I'm using this for convenience. So I'm going to set this on that rusty nut, and I'm going to work it down, even if I have to tap it down hard, to where I make sure it's fully seated on the nut. And then the first thing I'm going to do is come in here where I'm not torquing out at the end of the handle here, and I'm going to see if I can break it loose. Just a light tweak. Okay, it moved. Now, if it doesn't move, I recommend you come back in here and soak this up some more, or you may even have to use some heat. But once you get it to move, then it's very likely you're going to have success at getting this off. But the most important thing here is you don't just take this wrench and start spinning the nut off. That's where you'll run into a problem, and that's where you'll break the stud off in a situation like this, or you'll break the head off a bolt over here if the threads are rusted in to the body panel. Once I get the nut or the bolt to move, then I'm going to remove the ratchet wrench. And from here on out, I'm going to use a nut driver. Now, there's a couple reasons I'm going to use a nut driver. Number one is I don't want to be applying an excessive amount of torque. So the nut driver is going to keep you from over-torquing that stud or bolt and breaking it. The other reason is I'm going to be working it back and forth. So I don't want a ratchet. If I had a ratchet, I got to keep changing direction. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to use as much torque as I can with my hand. I'm going to turn it out until it gets hard. Once it gets hard, then I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to rotate it back in. Then the next time I'm going to turn it out and I'm going to go a little bit further. And now I'm going to turn it back in all the way down to the stop. And the next time I'll rotate it out and it'll go a little bit further. Now right here I'll stop. Go ahead and soak it again. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm trying to rethread the rusty threads, if I can say it that way. All right, let's try it again. Out, in. Pretty soon, if you do this, it'll start moving more freely, see? And you can see right here, look at the amount of rust coming out from underneath that nut. So it's really working the solvent into the threads, and by going back and forth, you're cutting those threads without putting undue stress on that stud. Once again, you do not want to break that stud off because it's really hard to fix that one. I'm going to come back now and we're going to work it back and forth, back and forth. Each time I turn it out, I go just a little bit further. And I'm feeling it here. See, once it gets tight, I don't give it any more torque. I stop and then turn it back in. Even if I have to go all the way in, then I'm going to come back out. Well, this is a really good example because this stud is rusted all the way up to the tip. So I'm going to pull it off again and come back in here and squirt a little more penetrant on there. Look at how effective that's working. You can see the amount of rust it's pulling out of the threads on that stud. Okay, back to work. Now, I know you're thinking, Kent, this is taking a long time. Not so. If you break that stud off, it's going to take a lot longer to fix it. And you'll find this in so many cases when you're working in and around these old cars. Just be patient and just keep working it in and out. See, right there, it's tight. Let's take another look. See, I'm getting closer to the top of that stud, but I've got a ways to go here, so we'll just speed the video up here.
And I'll keep working this back and forth. Now,
You can see here I had to switch hands because my right hand's getting tired. And I think you can understand why I'm not using a ratchet wrench here, because it could give you an excessive amount of torque. All right, let's take another look. All right, look at that. I'm right up to the top. Now here in a few more turns, this is going to come right out. Look at that. All right, look at that. I just saved a rusty old stud and removed this very rusty nut. Let's go over on this one and see if this is going to be a problem. Put that on that particular bolt. We're going to turn it a little bit. Look at that. That one's a problem too. Now here, it's almost impossible to get a nut driver on this. So I'm going to use a ratchet, but I'm going to put my hand in real close to the head so I'm not over tightening. And of course, I'm going to have to reverse direction. We'll move this in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to stop, and we'll get the penetrant and give it a little more penetrant. You see, once you start loosening up the nut or the bolt, that will allow the penetrant to soak more easily down into the threads. That's why I stopped 2 or 3 times through this operation as I'm working this bolt out. See how I'm using my hand right by the head to use the torque? Now this one's going to come right out without having to do the back and forth. If it were to get real tight, then I would go back to that back and forth movement until it loosened up again. And now this one is ratcheting out freely. Okay, look at that. Look at how much penetrant has soaked down into those threads. And once again, I just saved myself a huge problem. If I were to break this bolt off, my best option would be to take this false firewall out and try to drill through the broken bolt and rethread it. If I break this stud off, well, then I'm going to have to drill through the body and pick up another point where I can anchor this battery box down. Now these other two, let's just check. Oh, these are going to be fine. Usually if they're not rusty, they'll come right out. So there's no problem. These are going to come out by hand. All right. Okay, the battery tray is loose. I hope you find this helpful. This can save you a lot of grief if you attack these rusty bolts and studs in this manner.